every single person, male and female, has DNA. And that DNA comes from each of your parents. In fact, you get 50% of your DNA from your dad and 50% of your DNA from your mom. This shows up in your chromosomes, in your DNA. You have a pair at each location, and those pairs, one of that pair came from dad, one of that pair came from mom. Now, that sometimes gets a little hard to understand because I think in our brains we think, oh, well, that means I got 50-50 of dad's DNA and 50-50 of mom's DNA. That is not actually the case. You get a random 50% of dad's DNA and a random 50% of mom's DNA. So we're going to look at a little analogy to help you understand this a little bit better. We're going to take a look at names and letters as a metaphor for DNA that family members are going to inherit and then share with one another. So we're going to start off with a guy whose DNA name is Andrew. And Andrew very conveniently has 6 letters in his name so that we can pass on 50% of his DNA to his children. Now, what this does not mean is that he is not going to pass on a half of an A and a half of an N and a half of a D and so on. He is not cutting his DNA in half and passing it on to his children. In fact, it's going to be a random 50%. So Andrew and his wife Sandra are going to randomly pass on 50% of their DNA to their child. That DNA is going to get a little recombined here, and that child is going to become Edward. Now, there's another couple. That couple's name is Graham and Elaine. They also very conveniently have 6 letters in their name. They're going to randomly pass on 50% of their DNA to their child. That DNA is going to get recombined, and that child is going to be Angela. Okay? Now, you've got Edward and Angela, who are the second generation in this particular family, and they are going to have not 1, not 2, but 3 children, and they are going to randomly pass on DNA to each of those 3 children, and you'll see here that those children are going to look like they belong in the same family because they have a lot of similar DNA, but their DNA is not identical. Unless you are an identical twin, your DNA is not identical. You each get a random 50% of DNA from your parents, and that randomization process happens with every new child that particular couple has. So that's why if you cannot DNA test your parents, you need to be testing all of your siblings to make sure you get as much of your parents' DNA represented as possible. It's also important to understand that some information is going to show up in every grandchild, right? So Sandra passed on an A to Edward. Edward passed that on to all 3 of his children randomly. But as that 50% of his DNA got passed on, all 3 of those children ended up with them. Same with Graham there. Graham passed that G on to Angela. Angela passed it on to all 3 of her children. So one of the things that we're looking for when we're looking for who among the 27 million other people who have taken an Ancestry DNA test, who matches you, we're looking for those pieces of DNA that you have in common. And that's what determines that you're related and how closely or distantly you are related. Now, sometimes DNA doesn't get passed on at all. As a matter of fact, if you look here, you'll see that Andrew has an N in his name, and he did not pass that on to Edward, which means Edward doesn't have it, so he can't pass it on to his children. Now, Andrew may have a sibling who has that N, who passed it on to his children and grandchildren. Okay, so that N may exist somewhere else in the world, but it doesn't exist in Edward's line of the family tree. Andrew passed on a W to Edward, and that is a piece of Edward's DNA that did not get passed on to the next generation. So there are pieces of DNA that get lost over time. Now, here's a random side fact that I love to share, which is if, and for those of you who have math brains, you're going to totally get this. If this is overwhelming to you, it took me a long time to understand this. If a couple has 5 children, there is a very high probability that 100% of their DNA was passed on to that next generation in aggregate. Okay. But if they have fewer than 5 children, right, one child gets 50% of their DNA. If they have 2 children, those 2 children are going to, like, by the laws of probability, they're going to have an overlapping about 50% of DNA, which means that this second child, when you have two, is going to have about 75% of a parent's DNA totally. So it's half again as much. You add a third child, it's going to be half again as much. So they're going to have in aggregate about 87% of a parent's DNA, and then half again as much, and then half again as much. You never get to absolute 100, but 5 children means you're going to have pretty close to 100% of the DNA of those two parents that they have in common. So if you have siblings, if you have a lot of siblings, get as many of them tested as possible. If you only have a few siblings, get as many of them tested as possible. If you have no siblings, well, then you have to think about who else might need to be tested in order for 100% of the DNA in our family tree to be as close to represented as possible. Now, remember I said Andrew's brother may have inherited that N, and he may have passed that N on to his children or grandchildren. So if Andrew's brother's still alive, for sure, you always want to test the oldest living generation, because Edward here has 100% of his own DNA, even if he didn't pass it all on to the next generation. So if Edward's available, test Edward. If Andrew and Sandra are available, test them. But if they're not, who else is in that same generation? In this case, if Andrew's brother is still living, or if Edward has siblings still living, or if Edward has first cousins living, like, start to think in branches of your family tree. Who is it that could be tested that could help give us as much of the DNA of these older generations as possible?